Well, I see by the clock on the computer that it is 4 o'clock on the dot. So let me take this opportunity to welcome everybody. This is Learning the Great Campaigns of the American Civil War System. My name is Patrick. Hello. And we have quite a good turnout here. This is probably the largest turnout I've had for this presentation. And I'm seeing by my notes here that it's been a couple of years since I've done this live. So this will be a fun exercise, and I appreciate everyone being here today. I hope this will impart some new knowledge for you. I don't know to what level you have experience with the Great Campaign system, but I'm going to make this an invitation for you to join this system. It's my favorite of all the operational systems. I am an American Civil War nut, buff, enthusiast, whatever. I guess whatever the line is, just under reenactment. I'm probably there since I was a kid growing up here in Florida. It's not the deep South as far as everyone's concerned, but we certainly grew up. My family is all from the South, so it is something that was historically interesting for me as a youngin, as we like to say. So the framework I'm going to use for this is I am again streaming my screen here, and for those of you who are watching only on the stream, whenever I open up a window in Vassal, you probably will not see that because I have it focused just on the major Vassal window. So if I'm pointing to something, fear not. If you're in the Vassal room itself, you can open that on your own Vassal instance. I am recording this. I'm going to be putting this up onto my channel, which I have a YouTube channel that I've run for the last 3 years since the advent of COVID. Since everything locked down, I started recording sessions and instructional videos on this series, The Great Campaigns, which started out, I did a series of videos 10 years ago, just sort of as a lark, and it became, I put it out on Board Game Geek, and it has become very well viewed and appreciated by folks who referred to it back as a good instructional starting point for players. So today what you're going to get is a very small condensed version of that, what I do over a series of 5 videos in about 6 or 7 hours. I'm going to try to condense down into under 2 for you and give you just the salient points. The expectation here is that you are completely new or fairly novice to the Great Campaign system. I see everyone's got their mics muted, which is awesome. Thank you. If you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and stop me because I will ramble on if left unchecked. You may hear my cat occasionally in the background. She'll wander in and give her 2 cents. But other than that, I will start you through the framework that I like to use for this, which is very similar. And I will, after the video, after the live session is done, I will put a link to the channel, of course, and to the original series of videos that you could watch at your leisure. But I'm hoping today, the goal for you leaving this today is to at least understand the broad concepts of the Great Campaign system, how it works, and what you need to do as a new player to kind of just dive right in and play. So the best way to start this is to talk about what the system is, what the series is. It is the brainchild of Joe Balkowski, and who is still out there developing stuff. He took some time off, but he's back and he's working on some of the new titles for Great Campaign. So we are just ecstatic to have Joe back into it. Ed Beach, Chris Withers are also on the development team for a lot of the titles that have been coming out since 2001. It is a fantastic community, hundreds of players. The designer of this Vassal module right here that we're using today is one of the key enthusiasts in our, what we like to call our Spanish league in Spain, and that's Alberto Romero. A little shout out for him because he does phenomenal work on the Vassal modules, but he is also just the lodestone which attracts so many players. He has a GCACW academy in Spain, and he's just got dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of players in our European contingent. So this has been around since 1992 when it was first released as Stonewall Jackson's Way. And since then, we've had the original Avalon Hill titles, and then when Avalon Hill ceased production in 1998 with On to Richmond, after those titles, they moved on and Multiman Publishing picked it up. That brought us Grant Takes Command as the first MMP title, And then since then, we've had a reprint of Stonewall Jackson, well, Battle Above the Clouds in 2009. We've had a reprint of Stonewall Jackson's Way, which not only cleaned up and added some features and functions based on the new series rules, which I'll talk about throughout this presentation today, but also it unified a lot of things, and it also added an additional module. So what we're finding now is in the reprint process through Multiman Publishing is they're polishing up some of the original titles, packaging them into groups, typically by theme, and also adding additional content and materials to them to add a lot of value to it. So the price point is for some people a little steep, but you're getting so much value with all of this. Speaking of which, we are on the cusp here this year in 2023. I don't know when you're watching this later on, but in 2023 we're on the cusp of the reprint of the On to Richmond product, which was in high demand because of its scarcity at the end of the Avalon Hill run for so long that very few people have gotten to experience that. It is the Peninsula campaign, so it's a 1862 June. It covers the 7 days battles in all of that originally, but now what they've done is they've bundled it with the Grant Takes Command reprint. So now you have all of this Richmond and Central Virginia series of scenarios. So you have the 1862 Peninsula campaign, you have the 1864 Overland campaign along the North and South Anna on the way back down to Richmond, and now they've added a third module, which will be the Petersburg campaign. And a lot of people were like, there's a campaign to that and it's not just siege warfare? Well, certainly. So it tracks from June 1864 to the very end of April 1865. So you have a lot of that, and that's brand new to everyone. So we're all going to be seeing that, and that's in proofing right now. So we're hoping that within the next few months, definitely in 2023, we're going to see that hitting the market. So very excited about that. I guess a good place to start with this is I'm using the Vassal module here, and I want to explain right up front that it's going to look just a little differently than what you would see on the table. So if you have a physical copy of this, do not despair that this doesn't look exactly like what you're seeing. It is Alberto, as I mentioned before, has made this through a lot of, I guess, player interaction. He created what we call the all-in-one version of this, such that instead of having these large stacks of counters that you would normally have on the table, much of the information on these units is condensed to have several counters worth of information and statuses in one counter representation. So it takes a little getting used to if you're coming at it from the physical copy, but once you start playing this a lot on Vassal, as I do, it becomes just second nature, and it's also very, very efficient to look at this. So yes, somebody has learned that what I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to be using the Alt-click for pointing to different things here in the Vassal environment. Doug, if I could get you to mute yourself, I can hear you in the background. And what we're going to do is I'm just going to very broad brushstrokes talk about the Vassal module because I want to get into the guts of it. So before I go on, any questions or anything that from the group that you'd like me to address right out of the get-go? Hearing nothing, that's awesome. So we're gonna move right on. So the Vassal module here, like I said, has a more or less standard style among the different titles when you get these from the Vassal community. For the most part, some automation has been built into these. Most everything now has right-click functionality. So if you had played this 10 or 15 years ago when we first put the stuff into Vassal, it was literally the board and some pieces, and you move things around as if you were playing on the table. Now there's a lot of automation that has been scripted into it, which is fantastic. So with Alberto taking the helm on many of these and working in conjunction with Multiman Publishing from the development side, as these things are released in playtesting, they are pretty slick from the Vassal standpoint. So most everything that you want to do, you can do with a right click or some keystrokes. I'm more of a key person, so I use control and things to do this. So if you've ever seen any of the videos that Roger Kittleson and I have done over the last 3 years, you'll see a lot of this stuff. I record it and then I put it out and I trim out all of the thinky time that Roger and I do, and I can condense about an hour. I can cut an hour to an hour and a half out of most of the videos. So anytime you see that, if you multiply it by a factor of 1.5, that's what you would see in RAW. But because of this, in use of Vassal, as you become proficient with it, you can really play this opposed online quickly and efficiently. So across the top here, we've got a variety of buttons. The little surrender flag there is just to switch sides. If you came in as anything other than observer, then you could select Union or Confederate for some of these modules. Most of the time, especially in this module, it doesn't matter too much. You'll see some of the buttons across the top here. The Union flag and the Confederate battle flag are grayed out. That is where you would have perhaps hidden information or reinforcements. That would be dependent on you selecting a side. But if you played this observer or solitaire, you could pretty much use the game without needing to do any of that. Alberto has also built in the two little recover buttons there, the sunshine and the rain. That is the scripting that I was speaking of, where it will automate what is usually a pretty onerous task of going through each of your stacks, removing 3 fatigues, flipping them to exhausted, and you have to literally go through all of these things if you're playing this on the table. This is done for you quickly and easily with a mouse click, and I could not be more pleased by that. The actual counter there is the counter window, so if you need to switch or bring out something that's left out of the scenario save file, you can do that. It's got all of the pieces for this particular scenario module. And then you've got 2 sets of charts there. The actual Great Campaigns charts will have by tabs, and this one's pretty standard amongst all of the scenarios that Alberto has designed. You have more or less everything with the exception of scenario specific rules and charts in here. Obviously MMP from copyright reasons will leave that out, but most everything else here will get you going if you have a physical copy of the instructions or the playbook. Right next to that is the 3 little Here Come the Rebels specific charts. This will have there's 2 of them there. One is the specific random events and sequence of play that you could use. There's really no copyright infringement on that, so that's just a helpful aid to have right there for you. Then the little clock there, obviously each scenario will have a time frame and the number of turns. So this one will start it is a 1-turn scenario. This is the South Mountain scenario that I'm going to start with. It is September 14th only, so you get 1 and done, and that's it. We're going to talk about that and why timing is so important in this game. Then the little bugle, you will have in certain games, certain scenarios will have, in this one we have commitment, the Union commitment. So if you're playing this in the advanced game, you'll have a track of, for each event that occurs, the Union commitment will increase. So you have certain little specific windows like this. And then finally you have a victory point chart. I've got, just for this South Mountain scenario, it's really just about inflicting losses on each other. So there's not a lot of victory points to track. And then beyond that, you have a notepad, which is pretty standard for Vassal, and then you can hide the overall window and shrink it. You can take pictures, you can zoom in, zoom out. For those of you who have not taken the Vassal training course done by the Wargamer Bootcamp, you can certainly scroll north and south with your mouse wheel if you've got one, and if you hold down Control, you can do zoom in and out, and I believe it's Shift will take you left and right if you're holding Shift down with your mouse wheel. So that's a quick and easy way to get around the map. So Vassal, very straightforward, and for this South Mountain scenario, I'm going to be just zoomed right in here on the video, so there's not too much to pan around. I will point out that way up here in the northwest corner at Hagerstown is Longstreet and Hood and Evans and D.R. Jones. So you've got some units in this scenario that are pretty far afield. And the South Mountain scenario is my favorite to teach with because it's a set piece, and it has all the units within relative short distance from each other. So you don't have a lot of time in between before you're getting into some kind of what we like to call a fracas. But this is an operations level game, which means that each one of these hexes is about 1 mile in scale. And you can see the beautiful maps are really the big selling point for this. These are Charlie Kibler maps. They've also been touched up and redone. And even in this case, in the re-release of Roads to Gettysburg 2, we have the addition of a new terrain type. In the original editions, if you're picking these up from the aftermarket, these would have been mountains. So these orange areas are now hills, which they added since Grant Takes Command. So with Battle Above the Clouds, they added the hill terrain, and now all of these maps, as they're being reproduced, have a new and different terrain type, which will affect your tactical considerations as you're moving around the map. So yeah, I'm going to come back to all of the terrain and information and how that plays into this, but I'll just follow my framework here. First, I'm going to talk about the game pieces, just to kind of give you a quick overview of those. They're easy enough to figure out that you've got what you would consider the blue and the gray or butternut for the Union and Confederate pieces. In the South Mountain scenario here, because it is a one turn, essentially the Union is coming out of Frederick, moving up the National Road, and attempting to get to these various and sundry victory point locations. Ironically, I don't have my handbook handy, but I think it's like 5 or 10 points for this, and then if they occupy Boonesboro and Roarsville, they're also getting that. With this map also, they've put in, because it is one of the set piece setup scenarios, is we have these areas that are prohibited for the Confederates to move into. So all of these sneaky tactics of moving around the left flank through the South Mountains is not available. So you are forced to go through for the Union to go through the Confederates here or go around them. So let's talk about the game pieces. We are representing two major types of units here. Well, I'm going to pull. I'm going to start with Hooker here, and we've got infantry units with their, of course, corresponding NATO symbol. We've got cavalry units over here, like the 8th Illinois, and then we've got leaders in the case of Hooker. The wonderful thing about the game system itself is the units are pretty standard. I mean, we know how they work. As they're moving around the map, to simulate the passage of time and the exertion on these units, they are going to get fatigue markers. So again, if we were using the regular, the on the table version of this game, you would actually have a separate counter of fatigue level from 1 to 4. Right now, they are set to fatigue level 0, unless otherwise specified by this scenario. So I'm going to talk about Rodman here for a second. Rodman starts at fatigue level 0 at the beginning of the scenario, and I'm going to right click and show that you can do a fatigue and increase the fatigue either by right clicking on it, in which case it'll put a little marker here in green in the lower left hand corner, or if you are adept with the keyboard here, you can add and subtract them using the Control Q or Control W, which is kind of nice. It will go from green to yellow to orange, which is fatigue level 3, all the way up to fatigue level 4, which is the most that they can accumulate in a day. Once a unit has received 4 fatigues, then they are completely done for the turn. They are essentially a rock on the map, right? They cannot move, and they can still be attacked, and they can't do anything to react to it because they are completely fatigued. There is an optional rule about that, but we'll talk about that later. So part of the design for the Great Campaign system is, as the player, through your leadership, you need to efficiently and effectively manage these fatigues for all of these units. The units can activate independently, so I could, on my turn, I could activate a single unit, or I could activate a leader who, within his range of command, he could activate multiple units, and that is typically the more efficient way to move units around. We have not talked, before I get into all of that, we're going to talk about the concept of initiative in this game. This is not simply an I go and you go system. This is I perform an action. Well, first we both roll dice, and for the most part in these Eastern campaigns, Eastern theater campaigns, the Confederates have an inherent advantage where they will win all ties. So in addition to rolling high, any ties, so that's 6 more opportunities for the Confederates to win on ties. So they have a slightly statistical more likelihood of getting a follow-up initiative. So we will both roll a dice. We do this here on the system itself. We roll 2d6, and there's a blue and a gray die. So in this case, the left die is more often associated with the Union because we've color coded it as a blue die, and the right one is the Confederate. So at the end of my action, I would roll these dice, and now the Union, because it got the high roll, would get the next initiative. And their option is to do something, perform some kind of an action, and then roll initiative again, or they can pass. If both sides pass, or they have nothing left, any units that can be activated for any kind of reason in a turn, then the action cycle is done and the turn is essentially over. Now in this case it's a 1-turn scenario, so when we're done with the action cycle in South Mountain, we are done with the game. That's it. So a great learning one because you have very finite amounts of opportunities to do things, and one of the great learning parts of this is it more efficient for me to go this way, or to activate with a leader and roll poorly, or to move them individually, or whatever. So you have a lot of good command decisions. You have a decision tree that is just so rich. And this is one of the things that keeps me coming back to the game, because you're never sure that your plan is going to be able to be executed, because you can set things up and then you don't get the next initiative and the opponent will get it, and all of your plans and schemes have been confounded. So that is the concept of initiative for this game. Questions on this so far? I've shotgunned a lot at you in 22 minutes. Okay, good. So we've got we talked about the units here. I'm going to just go from left to right here to show you on these infantry units what these numbers represent. Obviously, you've got the division leader's name there. We got Rodman. He is part of the 9th Corps. We can see that all of these units have a leader, somebody with a color code that's the same. So we've got Reno over here, who is the Corps commander for the 9th Corps, and he's got units all the way up and down the National Road here. So he's got 4 divisions. We've got Hooker, who has 3 divisions here, and they also have his identification, which is the 1st Corps. They are in gray, so we can see that in the center of each of the division markers. So these are good little visual mnemonic tools to help you. We've got Longstreet way up here. He's got most everything, and then we got some that are hybrids. We got Longstreet and Jackson Corps, so D.H. Hill could be activated by either one of these leaders. When we talk about the concept of the leader activation, he's one of those kind of flex that can be activated by multiple leaders. But for the most part, each of these divisions are part of their requisite corps, and they have to be either activated individually or as part of a leader activation. So how does that work? Well, first it's good to know what the numbers do. So each one of these divisions has a manpower value, and this is one of the things that's been condensed into a single unit marker here with the counter. So Rodman, for example, has 6 manpower, which means the basic unit for infantry is about 500 men per manpower. So he's got about 3,000 men in his division. Meade has about 4,500. Hatch has 5,000. Ricketts has 4,500 as well. So that is your mental concept of how many men we're talking about here. Each one of them also has an intrinsic number in green here. That is their leadership capability. And you'll notice that each one of the individual division commanders that are named has a 2 under Meade, or under Hooker, and you can see Hooker himself has a leadership of 3. So one of the other challenges of the game is you want to utilize the optimal command structure such that when you are getting ready for battle, you are using the most tactically capable unit. And that either means we can see a lot of the units here on the Confederate side have either a 2 or a 3. For the most part, they're 3s. And we can see way up here we've got Longstreet is a 4. Whereas the units immediately under him, we've got Evans with a 3, Hood with a 3, and D.R. Jones with a 3. So for the most part, all things being equal, the Confederates have a slightly better or more advantageous tactical structure. So that is what the number in green is. And then finally on the right, the rightmost number here on each of these counters is the number of essentially artillery batteries that are attached to the division. So some of them have quite a bit. And these are all considerations that you will make when you're getting the units into place and then prosecuting combat. There are some, in some of the other scenarios, we have artillery. We have auxiliary artillery that are brought along so they can enhance, and they have like 6 or 8 pieces. They're the artillery reserves that the Union carts around. We also see over here we've got the 8th Illinois, which is a cavalry unit, so they're significantly smaller. And in this game, each manpower for a cavalry unit, I believe, represents about 750 men and horses. You can see that the 8th Illinois is not very capable. They are a 0 leadership and a 0 artillery, so they have nothing with them. They are just out there doing what the cavalry does, trying not to die, as it were. So we've looked at the unit markers and the leadership markers. I'm going to just talk about terrain here for a moment. Again, part of the beauty of the map is they're just gorgeous, but they represent all of the most important concepts of 19th century maneuver for this game. And this is where when I explain this to people, that it's not a game about necessarily beating each other up. It's about efficient movement and maneuver in this game because it is operations level. So one of the most noticeable things on this map are, aside from the beautiful terrain, is the road network. So all of the road network is what you need to use to your advantage. In basic scenarios, for the most part, you don't have to worry about things like rain. In the advanced games, so most every one of the game titles has 5 or 6 basic scenarios, and then when you're ready, you've done all of those. Those are essentially set piece. Once you're done with those, then you move on to the advanced campaign games, and that's where the whole series really, really shines, because it is literally, okay, here's day 1. Lee has crossed the Potomac. We are ready to invade the North. Go to it, and anything can happen. You have random events and supply issues and just all sorts of things that you are now forced to take into consideration beyond just moving up to the line and trying to attack another unit. So with these terrain types, we can see that we have clear down here, which for most things it's for them to move into clear, it just costs 3 movement points. Okay. And you're asking, well, how many movement points do you get? Well, when you activate a unit, let's say I'm going to utilize, I'll use Rodman since I'm here. He would go to fatigue level 1. I'm going to activate him by himself. And I'm opening up on the chart window here in the movement. They all have a basic calculation for movement. The Union, for the most part, essentially rolls a d6. So yes, you can call this series a roll and move game. The basic Confederate infantry units will have, because of their local knowledge, they'll have an inherent bonus of +1. So they will get a d6 +1. Then when you add leadership into it, if you activate units with their corps commander, then they're a little more stringent about how to make them move. So if I activated all of the First Corps with Hooker, for example, I said I'm going to march all 3 of these, and I roll a die for Hooker. Well, now I'm going to get a die roll +1, and just to show you how it works, I'm going to roll a die, and I roll a 4. So that would become 5 because I activated them with Hooker. And now it's just a matter of expending them one at a time how you wish to move. Obviously, moving along roads is the optimal because moving along a road in a sunny day is one movement point. So I'm going to say I'm going to move Ricketts down here. He's going to follow a railroad, which is just like a road, and he's going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And once he's expended all the movement points he has, you go on to the next one and you repeat. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You'll find that I seldom, if ever, move the most efficient route. And then Meade will go 1, 2, 3. And now we have our first operational consideration for this game is how do you move a very large force into an area where there's already, and you got to talk about logistics here. So in order to move this, I have 2 movement points left over. If I open up that movement chart again, I can see enter friendly occupied hex. I have to now consider how much manpower is already in that hex. And if it is anywhere from 3 to 11, well, if I'm going into a clear, which I am, then it's 1 additional movement point to get in there. So basically you've got to tell them to go around to the left of all that bivouac and organize them along the drill fields. So Meade could spend 1 plus 1, it costs him 2 now, and he can move into that same hex as Ricketts. Some of the new players I see will pick up that stack and they just start moving the stack, and that's not how it works here in Great Campaigns. You've got to take into consideration moving around other units, because even at 1 mile scale there's still a lot of bodies trying to occupy that same space. Okay, and Hooker would be attached to one of those, so I moved him for just demonstration, but he would be attached to one of the divisions and he will move along with them. So that's how movement works. If you try to move overland, well, it really just depends on the terrain effects chart. The clear is 3, rolling is 3, but then it gets pretty expensive. So if I'm moving off-road into some of these areas like this rough hex, or into a woods hex without a road, or even across a hill hex, that can be pretty expensive. So for the most part, you're going to be moving around and following roads. That makes sense. That's what you would expect. But that's where the trick of the game becomes. You're playing a traffic cop when you're moving these units around. So you need to get from point A to point B as efficiently as possible. So I've kind of shown you the little beginnings of movement there. I've shown you the individual the values on the units. Does anybody have any questions about anything to this point? Fantastic. So one of the operations that you can do when you get your actions is movement. And movement is as straightforward as you would expect. You are just going however many your die roll is. So at that point I finished all of the first corps' movement. I would roll again, and now it's a 3-5. So now the Confederate player has won the initiative and would get to do some kind of an action. So movement, again, straightforward. I talked about how leader activations work, so I'm activating multiple units at once, and the danger is that Hooker could roll a 1, right? Or Hooker could roll a 6. So you could go anywhere from 2 to 7 miles along the roads, depending on how superstitious you are about your dice luck. And for me, I'm pretty superstitious. So you have to kind of mentally figure out when is the right time to move units individually, or try to move them all in one big bunch. Okay, so movement is one action. You can do combat on the march. I'll come back to combat in a little bit. You can also do assault actions. So if you don't want to move and you're already in place, let's say that I've got Cox and Reno are sitting there up against Colquitt, and they're staring across the creek, and they're ready to go to battle. When we go into combat, we would, instead of be attacking or doing combat on the march, we're going to be doing an assault action, which is a whole little sub-process that you do to see if Reno can get those orders to Cox and have him send his men into battle against Colquitt. and that has a possibility of failure. It can fail on a roll of 6, which means there is always an inherent 16% chance that those orders are refused or not pulled off for whatever reason. One of the other things you can do in some scenarios, it may be important, there may be value to it, is if you have an infantry unit or a cavalry unit here in one of these red junctions that are along the railroad track. So any train stations, you can burn the railroad station. Sometimes there are some points just for damaging them. Sometimes you have to get points by completely destroying them. We'll pull out a marker here and just show you how that, let's see. Terrain marker, there it is. So we've got damaged and destroyed for these. So especially in a campaign game, it might be important to completely destroy these. And the difference being that you can use cavalry to just go out, set torches to these railroad stations, but it doesn't necessarily destroy them. It will simply damage them. Whereas if you have a very large infantry division out there parked on it, they will scour the earth around that railroad station and do Sherman's neckties and all that good stuff and completely destroy the rail system. So it may not be able to be salvaged. Whereas a railroad station that's damaged in a campaign game, you could potentially come back and fix it and still get the usage of railroad movement. So that's another action that you could do. And in 1864, and presumably when we get to Petersburg, 1865, so it does not apply to what we're doing here with 1862, you can entrench as an action. So it is possible for you to move a division into place, pull out your trenching tools, and dig, starting with abattis to breastworks to really fortified positions. So that is an action that you can do in certain games depending on what year of the game that is being played. And those are the basic actions. That's it. You're moving, you're doing combat. You can either attack on the march or you can attack with an assault action. And we'll talk about how you can make a grand assault. In this particular scenario, we can't because we don't have an army leader, but that is a possibility where you can bring in lots and lots of extra units, or you can burn railroad stations or entrench. And that is the entirety of what you can do as your actions for this game. So have I lost anybody at this point? We got a whole mess of people. I'm really happy to see everybody here. Ekro, yes.
Question, Patrick. The fatigue marking, it seems like that's keeping track of just every unit gets 4 rolls per turn. Is that really what that's keeping track of?
Yes, and I will send you the $20 for that fantastic segue after the fact. They accumulate fatigue either through proactive actions, like we were saying with marching, also as a result of combat. So I'm going to open up here the combat chart, and we look at the combat chart right here, and this is a perfect time for us to move into the concept of combat because it is the Civil War after all. When you look at this combat chart, on the left side is the defender and on the right side is the attacker, and it is an opposed die roll where you are taking into consideration a whole mess of individual die roll modifiers, which you become very adept at calculating kind of on the fly and mentally making note of. Now, for some people, that is one of the complaints of the games, like there's a lot of die roll modifiers. Yes, but it's also a lot of fun. So you have to offset that. In this, you'll notice on here that there's a lot of capital D's, the letter D on the combat chart, and that stands for disorganized. And what that means is a unit, for whatever reason, either being attacked or attacking and not quite doing as well as they had hoped. I'm going to point out Sturgis here. They can become disorganized, which for him is you flip him over and you'll notice that number 7 is still there. That's his overall manpower. That's 3,500 men in the division, but now his combat effectiveness is now a 5, so it's about 66%, which means that they have become disorganized, and whenever you become disorganized, you will get 3 fatigues. So if they've already had 1 fatigue for the day, perhaps, then they would go all the way to fatigue level 4. So that's the other challenge of the game, is inflicting damage, having that person expend fatigues, whether they like it or not, and that's the currency of the game. Once they have no more fatigue to give, well, then they are just done with that unit. So what a great question. Thank you. Anybody else? All right, then let's move on to combat, because we're doing really well here. So I'm going to flip Sturgis back over, and I will remove his information. Okay, so there are 2 ways to attack something in this game. The story I like to give for everybody is the first time I ever played, literally the first time I ever played Great Campaigns. I jumped into the 2008 Great Campaigns WBC online tournament. I had no idea what I was doing. I read the rules, loved it, sounded great, let's do it. They paired me up with a very experienced player. We were playing McClellan's Opportunity, which is essentially the next scenario after this. And the first thing I did on my action was, I want to attack something. Boy, was that dumb. I learned very, very quickly. I didn't know what I was doing. And at the end of the game, after losing pretty handily, I was given some very good advice about how to manage things in this game. And the one thing that I like to tell new players every time is, look at the combat chart. It is very, very bloody, as you would expect. There is a point of diminishing returns for when you look across the top as the attacker, and you can see it goes from 1/2 to 3, all the way up to 70 plus manpower. That is, we're talking super Gettysburg level attacks with multiple hexes all participating in a grand assault. That is a lot of manpower. But you'll notice that it gets to a point where even if you do well and you really outroll your opponent, you're still taking a lot of very, what I call friendly fire. You're getting a lot of bloody damage because of the casualties involved here at that scope. Conversely, as the defender, one of the shining things for the Confederate player is you can do sort of bobbing and weaving. I mean, they have the capability of sometimes attacking larger forces. It's not always advised, but you have the capability of coming in with a smaller force with some good die roll modifiers and not take as much damage as the attacker versus what you inflict on the defender. So you'll notice that on the combat chart, the number is how many manpower will be lost. The capital D we talked about, that's disorganized. Little r means that the unit will have to retreat. We'll circle back to retreats here in just a little bit. And then the big R is you've routed them. So you've driven them into panic flight and they're moving away from the battlefield. You can see that in some you've got some italics and you've got stars that are dependent on certain scenarios where you're trying to inflict actual panic on the army itself based on how much damage you've done to the opponent. But for all intents and purposes, the combat falls into 2 categories. You either attack while you're marching, or you are immediately adjacent to the opponent and you have a leader present and you're going to attempt to attack as an assault action. First, let's talk about attacking on the march. So I've got Reno here. He's with Cox. I'm going to just presume that he started this way. I'm going to give him a fatigue, and I'm going to say he's going to march. So I'm going to roll a die for him and add +1. He gets 4, which is perfect for this example. He has 5 total manpower to expend, so he's going to move into Bolivar along the road. So he has expended 1 movement point. I now have 4 movement left. So the first type of combat is attacking while you're marching, and it's up to you how much you wish to expend. I'm going to switch to the combat modifiers here along the charts. And you can see that they run from, for the infantry, we have a column of route, hasty, normal, and prepared. And depending on how many movement points I choose to spend, I can make this a very good or literally a very, ill-advised hasty or column of route attack. In this case, I've got 4 movement points left over for Cox. So what I could do is I could say I'm going to spend all 4 of those remaining points, and make a prepared attack. And we look over and we could see that that prepared attack will give me a +1 bonus as one of my modifiers. So when you are doing any kind of combat, I have a little cheat sheet that I kind of go through, and there's a little order of operations. You check the type. And if you've ever watched any of the videos with me and Roger, we pretty much do this the same way. You do the type of attack, so it's either an assault or prepared or normal or whatever. So you look at that die roll modifier and you give yourself whatever that is. And then you look at things like the ratio of units. So Cox has 6 manpower, Colquitt has 2 manpower. That means he is 3 times as large. So at a 3-to-1 odds, if I look back at my little chart there, I've got 3-to-1 odds, I will get a +2 attacker to defender. So that's another couple of points that I get there. So I've added +1 for the type. I get +2 because I'm attacking at 3-to-1. I also have a leadership tactical advantage because Reno himself is a 3 versus Colquitt's 2. So there's another +1 that I get. And then I would look for any other things like flanking, flanks refused, that kind of stuff. I would take those into account. Now I look at terrain, and in this case, I've got a creek in between the two of us. Now, if you read the rules for the game, it actually has you like add up both modifiers for each person and then roll a die. When you start playing this, I think especially online and Vassal in real time, you can make things very expedient by figuring out what is the difference. I've got a in this case, I've got what I call 4 up. I've got 4 in my favor, and then I've got a -1 to me because of that creek. Now that some will explain it, oh, well, you add the creek to the defender. You could do it either way you like, whatever mathematical operations you like for arithmetic. But then ultimately I have a +3 to my die roll. And we roll both the dice. And so that's where the nice 2d6 comes in. So the Union would be attacking at a +3 to his die roll. He gets ultimately a 6 versus the 5 that the Confederates rolled. And we would look at the combat chart. And you cross-reference whatever the difference now is. So the difference is a 1. And we'd look at the attacker. He had 6. So he would inflict upon himself, because he didn't really drive him out of there. I would take a manpower loss, and they would be disorganized and grab 3 fatigues for the day. So 1, 2, 3, and flip, and lose a manpower. So now he's down to a 3-5 basically. And then Colquitt, because it was a +1, well, what happens to him? He's a 2. All he does is get disorganized, and that means he gets 3 fatigues, and he flips. And he may voluntarily retreat. He does not have to. The only time you have to retreat is if the difference between the attacker and defender was at least a 2. So with a 2, that is a small r on the chart. You'll see. If you got a difference of at least 4, that's a rout, which will cause them to really move away. So in this case, Colquitt would be like, hey, I'm disorganized, but we stood firm, so we're going to stay here. All right, so that's an attack on the march. Any questions about that? Take a sip of water while you think about it. Okay, so that was how you attack on the march. Consequently, what you could do is, let's say I'm going to reset these guys here. Flip them back. And we'll say that Cox decided, prudence being what it is, he's going to get a manpower back. Flip back over. He's going to stay there. And then subsequently, on a turn, Reno decided he's going to bring backup in. Okay. Every one of the leaders, I did not mention this, but they all have a 3-hex command radius that is affected by zones of control. So zones of control is so important, and I didn't even talk about it because it has not affected our movement just yet, but I will come back to it. This is for those of you who like to refer to it as sticky Zox. Whenever a unit enters a zone of control, they must stop and either attack or just end their action. So in that case where Cox was moving up, he was compelled to either just finish his turn and not do anything or stop, but he could not continue marching around to any of these roads because he has entered Colquitt's zone of control. So let's say that Reno decides he's going to activate Wilcox, and Wilcox ultimately got a nice die roll, like, not like that, like that. He gets 7, so he goes 1, 2, 3, 4, and he is now here with Reno. So we got Wilcox and Cox, no confusion there. The other type of combat that you can engage in is what's known as an assault. Assault presumes that the units are already adjacent to whomever they're attacking and that they have a leader present. And this one's a little trickier because this is where leadership comes into play. The other number that I didn't talk about on these leaders is this small one. They don't carry artillery around with them, but they rather have their own individual leadership capability. And a 6 is not bad. 7 would be awesome, but in this case, 6 is not bad. So Reno decides he's going to send orders to both of his divisions, and they're both going to attempt to attack in unison Colquitt. So the first thing they do is they each get a fatigue just for the attempt. And then Colquitt must make a roll to see if his tactical prowess, his leadership capability, will allow both of them to participate. So I've got a 6 for him. I'm going to roll a die now, and I roll a 2. A 2 is then subtracted from Reno's 6. That means that the 4 that I have, up to 4 units in the same hex, infantry presumably, could participate in that. So I've had a massive attack with all the divisions there. If I had 5 of them, then 4 of them could participate in the attack. But let's keep doing this until, okay, perfect example. He rolls a 6. A 6 is an automatic failure, even though his command ability is a 6. So a 6 will always fail, and you'll just, decry the gods for your poor dice luck, and you'll end your action and roll the next initiative. But in the case here, he rolled a 2, so that means that both Wilcox and Cox can participate. So now they add their combat numbers together, their manpower numbers, and that is, so again, we go right through the same numbers again. Instead of a prepared attack, like we did on the march, we'll do an assault. So the assault is the same, it's a +1. Leadership is again a +1 because it's still the same thing, it's 3 versus a 2. But now we've got Wilcox and Cox, they have 13 total manpower versus Colquitt's 2, so that is a 6-to-1 ratio. And that's when it's sometimes advantageous to really ball your fist up and punch hard. So now they get a +5 for that ratio bonus. I did not talk about artillery. That is also a consideration here. In the previous example, I had Wilcox there. He has 3 artillery pieces versus Colquitt's 1. So you will always evaluate that. I did not in that example because mentally I saw that he had 3. But when we look at the combat modifiers, you have to, this is one of the things that has been streamlined for any of you who tried this system way back 25, 30 years ago and have since come back to it. This is where the standard series rules have unified and streamlined the artillery concept in this game. And I think this is the way I learned it, so obviously I'm inclined to use it. Some people who are still playing the original titles that they buy off of the internet, you can do the old-fashioned way, but it's highly encouraged that you use the new artillery modifier concept here. Essentially, you just look at both of them, and if there's at least a 2 differential in favor of the attacker, well, depending on the type of terrain you're attacking in, so I'm attacking into rough here, well, I've got at least 2 more than him, so I don't even need to worry about it. Artillery is just not even a factor. We're outgunning them. But if I didn't have, let's say I didn't have Wilcox there and I only had Cox. Well, Cox has 2 artillery batteries. Colquitt has 1. Now I have to look at this little artillery modifier chart and see, oh, in rough, there's a little asterisk and a -1, which means that there's a chance that Colquitt has his artillery all set up and ready to go for the attack. The Confederate player would roll a die, and if it's an even die roll, then that -1 would be applied. So, presuming that that's that case, he would roll a die, and it's a 3, it's odd, artillery would still be ignored. Uh, in this case here, because I've got, geez Louise, I've got 5 pieces of artillery versus their 1, I've got a +4, which is still no effect. So in this case, it's very, you got to have a really severe differential and in good terrain to have artillery not be a negative for you. So in this case, I've got still the -1 for the creek. I have 7 positive and 1 negative, so it's a +6 to my die roll. So the Union would roll combat again, and now it's even die roll, so it's a +6 ultimately. And then when we look at the combat chart, for a +6 on a 2 manpower is I would inflict 1 damage, 1 manpower loss to them right off the top, and then I would send them disorganized and routed away, which this is what this looks like. They're demoralized. So this is a status that they can get, which is beyond just disorganized. They are demoralized, in which case there's 2 levels of that. There's demoralized 1, demoralized 2, which means that they're pretty much sitting out of action for the rest of this scenario at the very least. In a multi-campaign or multi-day campaign, that's part of your consideration is, all right, boy, Colquitt's he has been laid low. He's got to sit and rest for a couple of days and just do nothing and try not to get any more scrapes so that they can rebuild and become reorganized. So that's the 2 flavors of direct combat. The one that we don't have ultimately here, but I will. We don't have any army leaders in this case because it is just the kind of simple learning scenario. But if we had either McClellan, I will bring McClellan in here just to kind of show you how it works. Let's see, Union leaders. Where are you? There you go. Okay, so let's say I brought McClellan in there, and he's just chilling with Reno. And Reno also had managed to get somebody all the way up to here. The next step beyond a regular assault is a grand assault, and that is a step that you can take. Let's presume that Reno rolled just like he did before. Both of those units can participate. Now the next option is to attempt a grand assault. And a grand assault, problematic for one because it's the young Napoleon here. He's a 4. So it has to be less than that number. A tie will not do. One of the considerations for Reno in this case, if he was a 5 and he rolled a 5, that's a 0. 1 unit would still be forced to participate. In this case, McClellan, he has to get a 1, 2, or 3. So we would roll a die to see, and that would be a failure. Let's keep rolling. In this case, now he's got a 2. So if he rolled a 2, that means 4 minus 2 is 2, of course. That means up to 2 additional hexes. Let's say Rodman was here too. 2 additional hexes of my choosing can now participate. And I can add as many or as few units from each of those hexes into the battle itself. So now I could add both Rodman and Sturgis to the battle, and now I would have, 13, 19, 26 attacking Colquitt here. And that's what you call a powerful punch. But as you can see, there's a lot of moving parts to that. There's a lot of dice roll heartbreak that comes with that. You really, really in your heart want that grand assault to come off. It will never come off when you really, really want and need it to. So that is one of the wonderful elements of this game is poor planning cannot overcome just the vagaries of chance and ignoring of rules. Let's see. So that has given you pretty much the concept of combat. I could talk about some of the other specifics of flanking and cavalry and how the cavalry works. But I will pause here for a moment. If anybody, we're at a 1 hour. If you guys want to take a 5 minute water break or something, I'm going to take a sip and step away for a moment and then come right back. But if you have any questions, be thinking about those questions and I'll take them as soon as I get back. I'm back. I know that was not 5 minutes, but I will certainly entertain any questions that anyone has before I step into the next couple of concepts here. Anybody?
The fatigue and disorganization, are they? Well, I'm assuming, does fatigue get reset to zero if this game goes on to another turn? Does it everybody reset to zero for the next turn?
That's a great question. Man, you're just racking up the bucks today.
Need the money.
At the end of every action cycle, and that is what I mentioned up here is part of this recovery button, is all the units will go through and reduce 3 fatigues. So if they get to fatigue level 4, that means on the next day they will start with 1 fatigue. They will also, in this case here, I'm gonna have Wilcox and Cox. I'm gonna move them out here, and I'm just gonna show you. I'm gonna hit the recover button just so you can see what happens. So they're at fatigue level 3 today. When they recover, they lose the 3 fatigues, and they've now got the white stripe at the top. The white stripe indicates that they are exhausted. And the exhausted brings up a very critical part. Next part of the movement is that it's very easy for units to become disorganized or to start disintegrating through what's known as extended marching. Whenever a unit gets to fatigue level 3 or 4, when they're in a normal capacity, they will roll a die and see if they start to become disorganized and lose cohesion as they're moving. Hey, look, there's crops over there. Let's go get us a pig and all that good stuff, right? So that causes some of that, just the stragglers that we would expect to see in 19th century combat and movement. If they are already exhausted when they get to fatigue level 2, then that's a little, they start rolling for extended movement, extended marching a little earlier. So Wilcox, he starts to march. He gets to level 2 here, fatigue, and here's his movement because he got activated by Reno. Boy, howdy, he can move, right? He can move up to 7, but the very first thing he needs to do is, and depending on who you're playing with, if you look at the order of operations, you do it before you march because that will influence your what you may be doing as far as where you put that unit. So the first thing you would check is an extended march. All things being equal, the Union have a inherent more likelihood because they have a +1 to their extended march rolls. So he would roll here, and on a 5 or a 6, they would flip. And he's fine. He rolled a 1, so he just continues along his way without any stragglers. Everything's still in good order. If he had rolled a 5 or a 6, if he's organized, he will flip to disorganized. If he is already disorganized, he starts losing manpower, and you can see that on the movement charts there for extended march, there's a little extended march on the side. There are modifiers again that get horrendous if you're exhausted already and going to fatigue level 3 or 4. It's very likely that you're going to start peeling off people. Then, depending on the size in manpower of that unit, then you start losing anywhere from 1 to 3 manpower. Now, the good thing about it is that typically in most scenarios, unless otherwise stated, does not count as victory point losses for you. It's just kind of a headache because I had 7 manpower and now I have 5, right? So you do not have as many bodies to work with because they've all decided to pull off to the side and eat apples under a shade tree because of marching. So that's extended march. The other concept is you can do a force march. I'm going to flip them back over. Wilcox, let's say he rolled poorly, because I like that 1 that's sitting there now. I rolled a 1. That means he can only move 2, but I really need to get him all the way down, or up around here somewhere. So what he could do is declare a force march, which means he voluntarily, and they have to be organized, to do this. They cannot be disorganized to force march. But I could flip him, and he's got a 2 as his initial manpower or movement points. But now I'm going to roll for force march, and that is a die roll. In this case, normally what you do is you subtract 1, and then it gives you whatever extra. This was fairly poor because that's me. Uh, but the great thing is you always get a minimum of 2 extra movement. So he had 2 to start. He forced march for 2 more, and then he goes 1, 2, 3, and 4. So that's how force marching work. Also, if I had rolled very high, like a 5 or a 6, I would also lose men in straggling. They would fall off. My manpower would be decreased. So there are lots of little choices and decisions and things that you need to make when you are doing just moving the units around the map, because you've got to take terrain into account. You've got to take into account the defensive positions and defensive terrain that you're trying to either attack or get around. And obviously, these mountains are very precarious. Coming back to the concept of zones of control, every unit will occupy and exert a zone of control all the way around him, provided that it's passable terrain. Passable means that, for example, Garland here, he exerts a zone of control into Frost Town, and where Colquitt is, and where the 5th Virgin, and of course on the backside. He does not extend a zone of control into these mountains here because there's no road into where he would cross into those mountains. So for the most part, mountains and woods, depending on the sides of the hex where that unit is going by, those are not zones of control for the purposes of moving. So let's say Rodman is here. He would have to stop immediately because Garland does exert a zone of control into there. And then, like I said before, Rodman would have to make that decision of either sit there and finish the activation, or do some kind of combat and attack. Attacking into mountains gives some inherent bonuses to the defender, of course. Gives like it's a, depending on how you look at it, it's a -2 to the attacker, or +2 depending on which side of the equation you want to put it on. So attacking into mountains is always a tricky prospect, especially because that's what they're simulating here. We're attacking into Turner's Gap and Fox's Gap. So the Battle of South Mountain was fairly difficult because they just kept throwing more bodies into the gaps, and fewer men were able to maintain battle cohesion and hold off a much larger force because they were, defending these very tight spaces. Let's see what else I got. Let's talk about any other questions on that. Okay, so let's talk about flanking. Excuse me. Let's talk about flanking, and then we'll talk about retreats and routes. That's usually where I finish things off for the day, and then we can push some counters around if you want. Let's talk about flanking. So in this case here, Colquitt is in a dangerous spot. He is flanked. And flanking is important for 2 considerations. It gives more positive die roll modifiers to the attacker. If you can completely surround a unit and exert zones of control in all 6 hexes around him, then you're going to get a very nice, juicy +4 modifier. So flanking is the ultimate way, especially for the Union player, that he can spread these units out and kind of attack in mass and cut off avenues of retreat. So flanking is good on the front end because it gives you bonuses, but it also causes retreat losses whenever a unit is forced or compelled to retreat into zones of control that he would not like to. And there's a chance that they're going to lose more manpower. In this game, the victory points for every scenario has an inherent positive, negative for the attacker losing victory points from manpower loss, or not the attacker, but one side losing victory points for losing manpower and gaining it for attacking the other side. So it really just depends in each scenario whether who the aggressor is, if it's the Union or the Confederate player. In this case, South Mountain, the Union is attempting to smash their way through the gap, right? But they're also getting points for not only occupying these victory point locations, but for inflicting manpower losses. So one of the skills that you learn as you become more adept at playing the game is how to set up your attacks so that you can potentially, you may get some attacks that will give you victory points by smashing a unit, like we saw here with Colquitt just being overwhelmed by a very large force. But he even said he was only a 2 and he only lost one manpower. When you can attack with a very large force against a substantive force, then you can inflict a lot on the front end, but more often than not, if you've set up your units to approach correctly, as the defender is forced to retreat out of that hex, he's going to go through terrain that is not good for them to pass through, and that will often involve zones of control. And that means they're going to lose manpower, and it can be very, very bloody because of the chaos as they're fleeing from that battlefield. So first, let's just we'll talk about the flanking here. In this case, I've got a full flank to start with on Colquitt. And flanking always works in kind of two phases. You check sort of the first step is to see how many hexes you cover, and then the second step is to remove things that do not qualify, and that ultimately gives you some kind of a die roll modifier. This is the trickiest part for new players because, hell, I've been playing for 13 years and I'm still, if I'm going too fast, or in your heart you really want it to be this calculation, but oh, I missed that. That happens all the time. So really the best thing to do is to take it step by step. So in this case, if I was attacking Colquitt from Reno and Wilcox, I would go through and do a flank check, and I can see that currently I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 hexes. I have zones of control into all 6 hexes around Colquitt. That's the first step. So that would immediately be calculated as a plus 4 flank. So if nothing changed, I would get an extra 4 die roll modifier to my outcome. Then step 2 is you disqualify anything that has either impassable terrain from the unit or from the defender, and if there's a presence of any friendly to the defender. So in this case, I had all 6 hexes covered, and that would give me a plus 4. But Garland's there, and the 5th Virginia are there. So that would take 2 away from my final plus 4. So I would only get a plus 2 as my final flank calculation. Okay. And again, if I had certain areas where I didn't have a road through a mountain, or it was impassable from whatever reason, then those will also chip away at the potential. Whenever you have a full flank on a unit, the worst that could ever happen is it will come down to a plus 1. So the bare minimum that you could get, even if it would be reduced mathematically to 0, is still a plus 1 for your trouble. Another thing that Colquitt could do is, if he saw that attack was coming, he could put up a flanks refused marker, which is basically they get to a location and they spend a movement point to place that, or if he's already in place, he can essentially march in place and he can put this flanks refused, and then that will change the calculus right off the top. So a plus 4 flank would really start with a plus 2 and then get taken away from there. So it's a way that you could prevent, as the defender, being flanked if you think that you're in a spot where that is likely to happen. However, there is a net benefit. We talked about the minimum of plus 1. Even if I didn't have a flank on anything, if I was just out in the open and I had a flanks refused marker on and I get attacked, that's still gonna be a plus 1 modifier, because I have set myself up into this square or whatever to try to refuse all these flanks, and then I'm just being attacked up the center. So there's still an inherent bonus for the attacker because you're being, I guess, overly cautious, or from a maneuver or an organization standpoint, You're you're protecting the sides in lieu of the center. So that's what that represents. So in this game, you definitely want to try to attack with flanking whenever it's possible. Use the terrain to your capability. Uh, Not only for the attack on the front end, like I said, but to also, let's say Rodman got all the way down here, or you know, just total wild hair. He got all the way back here. He is making it so that as Garland needs to retreat, he is encountering the zone of control of Rodman. Um, you know, and we haven't talked about retreats yet, but retreats can get very, very ugly quickly because of the presence of the enemy units. So that is flanking. I know that's a bit of a headache for people, but suffice to say, it's one of the critical parts of the whole game. We lost a few people, but that's okay. You guys are still here, so I will take any other questions you have before I talk about the next concept. Okay. Well, then let's talk about a couple last things. One is I'm going to do retreats, but I'm also going to bundle that in with cavalry. We've left the poor 8th Illinois here down here doing nothing. So I'm going to talk about cavalry for the minute. Cavalry have really two purposes, and maybe more depending on what kind of campaign play that you're doing. Their job is to, well, the Union job for the cavalry is to not be killed by Stuart. You can see that they're fairly pathetic. They're small, but they're great for occupying areas like passes and things like that because, again, they exert zones of control, and when units enter those zones of control, they are forced with a decision. So they either need to be aggressive or not do anything. So they're great for stopping up little areas like that, controlling, like in Wolfsville, exerting control on this wonderful crossroads, because that's what cavalry does. They're also great for damaging railroad stations if you need to do that. And even when you mass up several cavalry, that's that's nothing to sneeze at. If you can get 3 or 4 manpower in cavalry there behind this creek, you can see I've got creeks all around me. So they're in a pretty good defensible position. So one of the skills of the game is learning how to adequately utilize cavalry for screening, for going out and doing intel gathering. If you're using the limited rules in the campaign games, that's a key element. You have to send them out because all of these units will be hidden under force markers, and you have to get a cavalry close enough by a Confederate unit, for example, if it's in this Union, to see what's going on and to get information about that unit. So that's something that Roger and I have started doing in the last year or so as we play the campaign, is we like to start using the limited intel or fog of war rules that are in the game. And that's it gives a whole new usage for your cavalry. The last possibility for cavalry is, I talked about screening. Whenever a unit would enter their zone of control, so I'm going to use Garland as an example here. Let's take off his Garland marches, and he gets down to Frosttown here, and he's trying to come around the flank. The 8th Illinois can do what's known as a cavalry retreat. They opt to take a chance that they are going to do a fighting withdrawal to slow down the unit that's entered their zone of control. So in this case, Garland would offer me, would you like to do this? And I would say, yes, I will. They flip over, they become disorganized in their haste, they get a fatigue, and depending on the size of them before all of that happened, in this case he was a 1, so he's a very small one. I will roll a die and I will subtract whatever those modifiers are. The one thing I absolutely do not want, which you know is going to happen when I roll a die here, is to roll a 1. If I roll a 1, that cavalry immediately loses 1 manpower. In this case, he would evaporate, and that would be a manpower loss, victory points for the Confederates. But in this case, I'm going to roll a die. He rolls a 5, -2 because he's very small, so it'd be a 3 ultimately. And we take that 3 and we cut it in half and we round down in favor. So that becomes a 1. That 3 goes to 1.5. Remove the fractions, it's a 1. So Garland would lose 1 movement point, and the 8th Illinois would be forced to scurry away. And they must go a minimum of 4. 1, 2, 3, and 4. They can go up to 6 if they wish. If I really wanted to get them out of harm's way, they could go up to 6 hexes away. Okay, so they follow the same retreat rules, which we're going to come to in just a moment, as if a unit had been routed in combat. It's a minimum of 4 and a maximum of 6 hexes in retreat. But then Garland can now, if he has any points left over, he can expend them as usual and keep going. Try to get to it. He was not in a zone of control at that point because I ran away, and then he can come around and start threatening Wilcox. Okay, so that's cavalry retreat. That is a key tool. One of the other tools in this toolkit you'll hear me talk about is knowing when to do cavalry retreats and kind of peppering them around your enemy so that you're forcing him to expend energy to try to get somewhere where he wants to be. I think the last thing I want to talk about then is the concept of retreats and routes. And again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This is in the video series. So, and for those of you who realize how adorably rough those are, I do know that. I'm hoping at some point to go back through and redo them all with some of the current modules, just so that there's a little bit that I can refine for this instruction. But let's talk about retreats. So Wilcox has forced Colquitt to retreat. And let's say that, we'll say best case scenario, Rodman's here. Colquhoun has been driven into flight by getting a rout, and he even lost a manpower. So he's going to get all kinds of losses there. He's going to flip, and he's going to be reduced in manpower. And let's come down and see, demoralize, decrease. Okay. So in this case, he would be forced. A normal retreat, a little r, is a minimum of 2 hexes and a maximum of 4. But in this case, he got 4. He got routed, so he has to go a minimum of 4 and a maximum of 6. I'm going to pull up the charts here for retreat priorities. This is, without a doubt, for new players, the most confounding part of the whole series. I totally understand. They are written in some very legalese, but there's a really good rule of thumb for retreats that you can understand. The ideal situation is you want to get away from whatever person is attacking you in the most direct way, by roads if possible, avoiding unit zones of control for the enemy or the actual unit itself. Now, depending on the likelihood of that, the priority chart is going to tell you, which of these cases. So the highest priority is get away from them, follow a road, be a hex farther away than where you ended up, and there's nothing impeding that. But as it gets worse and worse, when you get a situation like this where terrain and enemy zones of control and everything are in there, those priorities are going to degrade to the point where you can start losing manpower as you are moving away. So Colquitt, his highest priority is, if you look at it from hex to hex, he can't go here because it's impassable. There's no roads into that mountain. He's obviously not going to go into where these enemies are because the Reno attacked him. So his first step must be to get farther away by road. Now, if Rodman was not here, so if Rodman was up there, for example, this would be free and clear. This would be priority number 1. He gets away, he's going into the mountains, it's by road, there's no enemy zone of control. It got degraded a little bit because Rodman was there. It actually takes me down to priority level 3, where he's entered an enemy zone of control, but he's still farther away by road. As long as there's a road there, excuse me, as long as there's a road there, he's fine. But on retreat priority number 3, if there was not a road there or a friendly unit, now he's going to start taking a manpower loss for entering that hex. Okay. Um, you can get some very extreme situations where there's 2 4s there, priority level 4. Mentally, some people break these into 4A and 4B, which I think erroneously categorizes them as like a hierarchy, but they're not. They're literally one and the same. Um, it's just degrees of badness, depending on whether there's a road present or not. So if a unit has been surrounded and is forced to go through a bunch of zone of control, and there's not a road or a friendly, he's going to take manpower losses very quickly. And it's going to be bad as long as he's going through all of these areas. Now, Colquitt, nicely, he's away and there's no problem. He continues to march away, so he's gone 1, 2, 3, and he can get back there to Boonesboro with no problem. Where it gets very tricky is if Cox has arrived down here, and now Colquitt has gone into this hex. It's great, but he cannot enter a zone of control here. If I mean that's the ideal if he's got other options. So if he goes here, that's a lesser priority, but may be required depending on what he's doing. But he could also take manpower losses because he did not fulfill the ability to move farther and farther away. So in this case, it'd be like, well, I can't go into this zone of control, but that is a higher priority than not moving farther away, so he may have to. Oops. So he'd come down here, but he's following a road, so that's okay. Cox is not going to hurt him, and then he could. In this case, he has to get out of a zone of control. He has to get away from that unit. So instead of going to roads, you would have to go to here instead. It's not in a zone of control. It is farther away, and it is following a road. Again, all the highest priorities possible. And again, for new players, this is like, oh my God, what am I doing? But if you take it literally one hex at a time and just kind of evaluate them, it is you start to get used to patterns, and you can see, all right, yeah, this is I'm in a bad situation, and I'm in retreat priority 4 no matter what I do. So how do I make the best of this bad situation? And sometimes you can't, especially if you've got a pair of units here like this, and they get into a situation where they've got nowhere to go. They can start individually losing because these numbers that are on the retreat chart for manpower losses, they count for both individual units. So each one of them would have to take 1 manpower loss or 2 manpower losses. So having multiple units in retreat is a very, very ugly thing when you're a defender. It is not a good situation to be. So if they have nowhere to go at all, let's say the Union just managed to block up the gap completely, and they were here and got attacked. Oops. They were here and got attacked, and now they've got just nowhere to go but closer to the unit that attacked them. Well, that's, we're into -2 per unit manpower. That's ugly. And if they were completely surrounded, like Sturgis had them here, and they were attacked, they got nowhere to go. They would just have to surrender completely because there's just nowhere for them to go. Or they would have to retreat through a unit if they and lose 3 manpower for going through the enemy. Again, these are not ideal situations. They're pretty bad. So that's retreating for the most part. That's like the 10,000-foot view. Take it a step at a time. Small retreats are pretty simple. There are only 1 or 2 hexes. We talked about the voluntary retreat, that a unit, as long as they were not inflicted a retreat in combat, they may make a voluntary retreat of anywhere from 1 to 4 hexes, all the way, following these rules, of course. But sometimes it's a good way to, get a unit completely out of the way so that it's not going to be attacked again. That's what I've got for you today. That is a lot in 90 minutes for the Great Campaigns. I will entertain questions, of course, if you guys have anything, or if you need something demonstrated, I'd be happy to do that for you. But I want to say, first of all, thank you all to everybody who stuck it out and are still here. I really appreciate that. And feel free to go back and watch the video after the fact when I put it online. I'm not going to edit this one. I'm just going to put it out raw. So you're going to hear all my ums, uhs, and so's. And of course, I value your feedback. So if you see anything online that is wrong or you need follow up questions for, definitely put that in the comments of the video, and I will put those links here in the text section. But questions, anybody? Hearing none, you are dismissed. Class is over. I really appreciate it. Thank you once again, and thank you to Harold for inviting me to take part in the San Diego Historical Con. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of the sessions here for the remainder of the day. Ekro, did you have something?
Patrick, do you find yourself, is the main decision almost how far to push your troops moving? It seems like there's a lot of consideration given to, fatigue level and disorganization, and it seems like almost the main point of the game. Is that, do you feel that's true?
I do, and you were on fire today with these great questions. Yes, so this little one turn scenario, there's no tomorrow, boys. Everybody charge and kill. But if you're playing a campaign game, or even the basic scenarios, some of them run 3 to 5 turns. So there is consideration about, okay, exactly that. How far do I push them today? Oh, they got disorganized. Okay, do I really want to move them tomorrow, or do I want to rest them? Because I really need them into be perfect svelte fighting shape for day 3, day 4, day 5, whatever. So it's a patience thing. It really is. It can be a test of patience about how far, how much, and when. And managing all of that, because again, it is a game about maneuver, and just because you want to attack something right now, that may not necessarily be the best time to do it. So you're going to have some scenarios where units are 20 miles away, like in this one where we see Longstreet and all them. They've got only one turn to get down in to be any kind of use, and they may not be. If they roll ones, well, that just happens. So that is where you're like, okay, let's do this again. This is a nice turn, nice scenario, because you can just play it back to back in 30 minutes. But yeah, that's exactly it. Is just how much and when. Other questions? Okay. Well, like I said, I thank everybody for being here. And if you've not had the opportunity to jump into Great Campaigns, I will also put a link to the Discord server that we started up way back in 2020. So that helps with a lot of live opposed play, and they usually have the World Series on there as well. So I will put that link in there, and of course the link to the videos if you want to watch these. Excuse me, man, my asthma is kicking in. I'm sorry. If you want to watch these again after the fact, it will be there for you. So have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.